So focal length is another one of those key concepts in photography that you just simply need to learn and eventually need to master to get good in photography. Focal length refers to the lens's optical center and the distance between that and the camera sensor. Now, usually this is measured in millimeters, so things like 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 135 millimeter, those are all focal lengths. And learning it is a key point in photography and understanding how cameras work and how you can get those photos that you want. So let's see if I can break it down and help you understand how it works and how you can utilize it to get better photos yourself. So when talking about focal length, you're essentially referencing your camera's lens's magnification, I think it's safe to say. And if you break down camera lenses into categories by their focal lengths, you essentially have three categories: wide angle, standard, and telephoto. And as we go through these, keep in mind that I'm referencing the full frame numbers. And if you have an APS-C camera, that's going to be different. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, go back to my last week's video where I talked about how your sensor size affects your photography and your camera. But for now, let's hop into the first one. The first category being wide angle lenses. So this would be about 10 to sort of 35 millimeter range. So wide angle lenses have a shorter focal length, meaning that if you're all the way in the range of like a 10 millimeter, then you're getting close to photo being essentially the fish eye effect that you can see or you can use a filter for on smartphones. But the idea of a wide angle lens is to, capture a wider angle so you can get more into that single photo. This is really good when you're trying to bring in the background or the environment or the surroundings. So things like architecture, group photos, and landscapes are all great examples of situations where you really want to have a wide angle lens. Sure, you can use other focal lengths, other lens types for these photos, but generally wide angles will give you the best results. And then we have the standard lens range. This would be somewhere around 35 to 70 millimeters. Why it's called the standard range is because around this range is pretty much where the human eyesight is. The closest one to being what the human eye sees is around 50 millimeters. So that's why something like a nifty 50 is really good as an all-rounder lens, because it most accurately depicts what a human eye sees. So essentially, this standard range is extremely versatile and can be used for pretty much anything. And then you have the telephoto range, which is pretty much 70 millimeters and above. And what is the top level? It's the biggest lens out there. That's the maximum range at the moment. But telephoto lenses are essentially your biggest zoom lenses. So if you want to be far away from a subject, or if you want some really big compression, we're going to get to that in a second, telephoto lenses are your best bet. Portrait photography is another one where telephoto lenses are pretty much the best there is. But those use cases are why telephoto lenses are pretty much essential for wildlife photography, because you can't get too close to that bird, or sports, since you can't be on that pitch. You need zoom, you need a telephoto. So another thing that focal length also affects is compression. And what do I mean by compression is, for example, with wide angle lenses, they tend to exaggerate perspective. So anything that is close to the lens becomes bigger than they actually are, and everything that is in the background far away from the lens becomes smaller. Once again, this is why wide angles are great for landscapes, for example, but also in any sort of situation where you really want to emphasize the thing that is in the foreground. And when I say Exaggerate, it means compared to the standard range, human eyesight. And that is why telephoto lenses are the exact opposite. So they emphasize scale. By that I mean that it really compresses everything in the image closer together. So if you have a building in the background and a human on the foreground, using a big telephoto lens will make the photo look like the building behind them is huge, way bigger than it normally is. But that can also be used to your advantage to create a fantastic effect, because it's really great for emphasizing isolation and making the thing that is in focus more intimate. Also, why telephotos are great for portraits. Finally, focal length also has an effect on your depth of field. So it's not just about the aperture. So depth of field is the range of distance in the photo itself that is in focus. Usually this can be adjusted with aperture for a great degree, but focal length also applies to this. Generally, longer focal lengths, meaning telephoto lenses, create better background blur and really emphasize that effect. And that's due to the compression that I just mentioned earlier. So with all of that being said, there are a few things that I can recommend you do to start mastering focal length. And first of all, just start practicing. The only way to learn something is by doing it. You can watch 1,000 videos, but if you never do it yourself, you're never going to learn. Probably one of the best ways to learn about focal length is that you take the same picture, the picture of the same thing with various different focal lengths. You'll realize that you'll have to switch between your distance to get the same composition, but you also will definitely see the difference between something like a 16mm shot and a 50mm shot. That's on an APS-C camera. Kit lens stuff, Or the same effect can be applied to taking a picture with 24mm and 70mm focal lengths. Okay, second tip, use wide-angle lenses for context. The photo that you're taking is telling a story about something other than just a certain subject. You want to include more of that background and that environment into the shot. Then you want to use a wide-angle lens, so a shorter focal length. Like I said, wide-angle lenses are fantastic for landscape and architecture, but also if you want to include like a whole scene. Okay, third tip, portrait photography and telephoto lenses go like this. There is a reason why many people say that the perfect focal length for portraits is somewhere around 85mm. You're creating that isolation for the subject, meaning that it is the sole focus of that picture. But not only that, when you go a bit further, things start looking a little leaner than maybe with something like a 50mm, which is generally flattering. If you look at someone big like me, I definitely don't mind if you take a portrait of me, I look a little better, a little leaner. Yeah. Another great focal length for that though is 135mm as well. That's another very popular one. Next tip is, like I said before, but it needs to be emphasized. Remember that changing your focal length will potentially very drastically change your composition. So if you want to keep that subject in its same form, then you need to take that distance if you're zooming in. Or if you're zooming out, you need to get closer. Okay, next one, use tripods for stability. While this is very much a given, if you're using longer focal lengths, it's going to be a hard time doing that handheld, especially if you're using a camera or a lens that doesn't have stabilization. So use a tripod. And get a good tripod for that matter. It is a worthy investment. But if you do need to go handheld, there is a rule of thumb that you can apply, which is have your shutter speed at double your focal length. So if you're shooting at 50mm, make sure that your shutter speed is at least 1/100. But if you're shooting at 200 millimeters, make sure that that shutter speed is 1/400. So that you're getting rid of at least some of that jitter that happens when you handhold. And finally, just go out and shoot and experiment, because like I always say, that's what photography is about. Experimentation. So that's why I'm going to throw the ball to you now, to go out and experiment. But before you do that, leave a like on the video and tell me what you thought in the comments below. If you don't have any comments, if you don't have any questions, just say hi, because YouTube loves its engagement and it really helps out. But that's pretty much all that I have for you this time. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your week, and I will catch you all in the next one. Okay? Bye-bye.